their side of this and to say that this wasn't the case, but their voices were entirely drowned out. And so what struck me about it was that the voices that were able to appear as Jewish voices were only the voices of the union. Whereas there were Jewish teachers, there were members of Brooklyn College, 2 Jewish faculty who were centrally involved in getting grant money for the project. None of them could appear as Jewish voices, right?
And my mother's high school, which was not even in Ocean Hill, Brownsville,
yeah.
It was open, you know, it was staffed by white Ashkenazi Jewish teachers and the few black teachers who were there. I mean, what people think about what happened that year is like so completely different than what my friends and I experienced.
Yeah, yeah, no, absolutely. No, because the way that it really is portrayed is that sort of somehow these liberal lefties who were controlling New York City just gave power over to a group of people without realizing, and it's framed also as pandering, that they were sort of indulging these young black, these black community leaders who didn't know what they were doing. And whereas, what I found interesting too is when I did my student teaching as a college student at a charter school in Providence, it's run by this guy named Dennis Lipke, who in the charter school movement was a celebrity, right? And he made himself very famous because he took over a school in New Hampshire in a very poor white area and made it sort of just flourish, right? But when I went for my first day of student teaching, I'd begun discussing his work with him, and it turned out he was a student teacher in those schools. And he credited his entire vision of how to make a school in the service of the community to what he had seen there. But the thing that's sort of sad about it is that Dennis Lipke's become a celebrity for the work that he does, and Rhodey McCoy, after this event went down, nobody's ever, there are very few traces of him. There's no, I think he's probably dead now. But I had done an initial search, and so it's interesting sort of that it was able to translate into success for this other figure. But one of the questions that many people have asked about the conflict is why it was that many people watching it unfold felt that they had to choose between a left-leaning Jewish union and a community of color, right? And what many people said is this shouldn't have been a forced choice, that if the union had been a progressive union, what they would have fought for was decentralization with strong protections for teachers, right? Which at the time would have been a very progressive move. And yet that's exactly, it didn't happen at all. And so what in fact emerged was a sense that the union was the progressive reasonable voice that was sort of looking out for collective coalitional interests, and that the community was not, right? And looking at it, my honest just sort of overall sort of first response is just to say that, it wasn't an experiment without flaws, but what educational experiment has no flaws? There's none, right? And it should have been allowed to exist long enough, to generate concrete results. But the thing, as I'd said before, that really struck me was how it is that in scholarship this has appeared. It's almost presented as a consensus that this shouldn't have existed, this was a flawed moment, this is a sign of civil rights movement coming apart, etc. And the reason I'm raising it here is that one of the things that strikes me a lot about the present is that I think that question continues. In other words, which voices can appear as Jewish voices, right? And we're talking about this at Temple, and so one of the things that strikes me is that there's a way in which neoconservative Jewish voices are able to appear in an incredibly disproportionate way to the numbers of people that they represent, right? If you were just to look at sort of what it is that appears as Jewish, then you would think that we're all neoconservatives, right? And so there's a degree of being vociferous, which is completely, which masks and I think misguides people about its degree of representation. But the other thing that strikes me about it as well is there's an interesting way in which Jews have really been brought in, white Jews specifically, as the authoritative voice in being antagonistic to affirmative action. One of the things that strikes me repeatedly when you sort of listen on NPR, that when somebody's brought in to sort of say from an authoritative stance that affirmative action should no longer exist, it's almost always a Jew, and an Ashkenazic Jew. And part of me is wondering about why that's so. And I think there are a couple different layers to it. The official story that one's always given about why Jews oppose affirmative action is familiar to all of us, right? That Ashkenazi Jews encounter group quotas, they're against group quotas because they're oppressive, right? But I think there's an interesting way in which the authoritativeness of Jewish critics of affirmative action has everything to do with the history of a civil rights coalition. So there's a sense that these were once people who worked alongside blacks. These are people who have an intimate relationship with black communities. And so if they say this, it somehow must have greater credibility or legitimacy, right? But that's linked to the last point that I want to make, which is one of the things that I find why I find it interesting to revisit something like Ocean Hill-Brownsville isn't just the question of who gets to speak as Jews, but there's a way in which the grammar that it's set continues. And what I mean is this. If you look at many neoconservative writers, they explain their turn to neoconservatism as arising in the Black Power moment, right? That it was that moment that for them sealed the fact that these coalitions couldn't work, that they were based on a liberalism that was naive, et cetera. But what I find interesting is there's a way in which Jews in the late 60s, white Jews in the late 60s, were framed by former allies as bad friends. And what I mean by that is there's a sense that white Jews care more than other other whites, about the situation of people of color, right? And so there's a sense that, Jews, some Jews even over-identify with black people, but there's a sense that Jews sort of pay attention, right? But at the same time, one of the fruits of the civil rights movement was that there are many Jews who were able to benefit from civil rights legislation in ways that blacks could not, right? And so why I say bad friends is there's a sense that many Jews sort of know what's wrong with the system and yet benefit from it. And so we'll criticize it and then proceed to get all of its fruits. And so there's a sense that many Jews, white Jews, play this strange role of these kind of funny apologists. And I think in many ways, the move that neocons want to make is to just stop feeling guilty and stop being friends. In other words, to just say, let's just enjoy the fruits and forget any sense that there's a larger problem that's wrong. And I think there's this way in which neoconservatism is all about black-Jewish relations, and yet it's sort of beneath the surface as this sort of disavowed thing. And so I just want to wrap up by saying that in many ways I see Gary's project as entirely about expanding the ways that voices as Jewish voices can appear. I mean, in the end, the group's called the Cholashon. It's about setting the terms of conversation, many tongues, right? And so I think in many ways the situation that we saw in Ocean Hill-Brownsville is not gone. That when you want to criticize these things, you somehow cease to be Jewish in your criticisms. And that's a major problem. We need to be able to criticize these things as Jews. And if we're able to do that, we'll have made some progress in the direction at which he's looking.